All right. Without further ado, I want to introduce our first plenary speaker, who's a classmate of mine from, I don't want to say, we're not going to confess, right? You and I were not confessing how long ago. I'm not going to rattle off any years or anything. But Valerie was a few years ahead of me at Stanford, and she was my role model. I would say role model for me and for many in my cohort. Now, I know a lot of you guys are like, oh, because, you know, you're a woman and the whole... No, I'm kind of gender blind. It wasn't that really. What was amazing about Valerie is she was, of the Stanford grads, really one of the most successful academics. So we looked to her bright light. For those of us who wanted a career in academics, Valerie paved the way. Now, you might ask, well, what is it that's special about Valerie? She has two characteristics that I think really make a successful academic. Humility. Now, the humility comes for free because we were Stanford grads, as I mentioned at the beginning, so they don't teach you anything. So, like, you have to have humility. I mean, it's embarrassing out there when you're up against people from other places, like you know nothing. I mean, at least we had good peers, so we could call up our peers and say, should we know these things? And they said, yes, we should know. Okay, so humility, I think that's really, really important. The other thing is honesty. Valerie, okay, so there's this great quote, and I'm going to get it wrong. There's a great quote by Stigler where he says it's very distressing that when, you hear the answer, you know the answer to an economic question merely because you know who asked it. Well, people were saying, well, what's Valerie going to talk about? What's going to be the punchline? I don't even know. Because with Valerie, she's going to give you an honest assessment of what's going on. She's always my go-to person. She's not in a rut, and you're going to get the same answer every time. So I love Valerie's humility, her honesty. That's what's made her great. Valerie, without further ado.
All right. Thank you so much, Ellen. And I want to thank also the organizers, Paulina and Anmol, for asking me. And I'm so honored to be a plenary speaker. I think the first plenary speaker I saw at SED was Gianluca Violante. I was just so impressed with that. So to be on a stage that's at the same kind of forum is great. So I'm going to talk about an idea that's grown out of the work I've done over more than 10 years. And it's a particular part of that work which is trying to do a critical survey of the literature. In my case, in this particular case, it was multipliers. And when you do enough of those, you get a little frustrated because you'll say, well, the time series evidence suggests this, the macro models suggest that, and then there's the applied micro estimates. And I was always looking for a way to try to reconcile these. And that's what I'm going to talk about now, is I think I figured out a way that we can do it at least in some situations. And so that's why I'm going to talk about, do they add up using macro counterfactuals to assess micro estimates and macro models? So to get even a little broader, because this isn't just for macro, let's go back to 2010 when Angrist and Pischke had their paper about the credibility revolution in empirical economics. Now they went, they surveyed all the great innovations in applied micro and talked about, the golden age in applied micro, basically. I don't know if they use that terminology. But they did scold the macroeconomists and the industrial organization economists because these methods hadn't diffused to them yet, and so they were a little behind the trends, okay? Now, at that time, quantitative DSGE was king, and then there was still the long time series kind of macro being done. All right, now there were a few people who were doing applied micro kinds of things in macro. I'd even done some in the past, but there were some people using natural experiments and some of those newer methods that the applied microeconomists were so excited about. So In macro, we use natural experiments such as wars. Barrow and Hall were among the first, and I've certainly exploited it in my research. But also, let's say, timing of Social Security checks. A lot of this was done when people were testing the, say, the permanent income hypothesis. Okay? Then, because the interest rates hit the zero lower bound, suddenly people became interested again in fiscal policy as a stimulus, and that led to what I called a renaissance in fiscal research, and that I talked about in my Journal of Economic Perspectives paper almost a decade later, okay? And there I noted that those applied micro methods had diffused quite a bit to macro in the fiscal literature as well as in a lot of the other literatures. And they use Bartik instruments, they use natural experiments, all sorts of things, and then also a lot of regional fiscal analysis. And there were two caveats, though, that I raised in my JEP paper, okay? The first was actually counter to somebody, I won't mention the name, that was saying that now that we'd figured out how to use applied micro methods in macro, we no longer had to deal with those thorny identification problems that you get with aggregate data. And one of the points I made, and a number of us had figured this out back in 2010, 2011, which is that the estimates we get in applied micro don't just immediately translate to macro, all right? You have to use a macro model to translate them to macro. And that's why I said in my JEP paper, there is no applied micro free lunch for macroeconomists. If you want to answer a macro question, you either have to do empirical work on aggregate data, or you have to take your really good, well-identified micro estimates and translate them to the aggregate. And we have a lot of research doing that now. The second thing I noticed, and I kept noting, is what I said at the beginning of my introduction, which is we often get very different numbers depending on the method, okay? I don't think that any one method is better than another. I do mostly time series because I believe in specialization. But I think that quantitative DSGE models have a lot to say, and I think applied micro then inputted into quantitative DSGE models have a lot to say. But what do you do when those estimates are different? So the theme of this talk is that we should take that credibility revolution that Angrist and Pischke talked about one step further, and we should talk about plausibility, okay? And what we're doing here is taking advantage of this recent confluence between applied micro type of methodology and estimates coming into macro to see if when we take those micro estimates and put them in a macro model, whether we get plausible counterfactuals, all right? Now, I'm going to tell you a bunch more details on what I mean by this. But let me say why it's useful. First, microestimates and macro estimates don't always agree. Second, there's only so much time. If you've, probably some people here have spent as much time with other people's replication files as I have, but it takes a long time, paper by paper, to go through replication files. So I also do time use research, and there's a limited amount of time. There's this thing called a budget constraint. So my idea here is we can figure out which estimates deserve more scrutiny, okay? Which replication files we should look at if we're getting a counterfactual that's implausible. And then often the search for trying to reconcile them is illuminating, and I'll give you 3 examples here. Okay, so let me just motivate with a particular one that's from a paper I recently wrote with Johannes Wieland and Jake Orchard, and I'm going to talk about the 2008 U.S. rebates. And the reason I do this is ever since I saw the following couple things, I said, somebody needs to reconcile those, and nobody did, and so we decided to do it. Okay, so there were rebates given out in 2008, and very soon afterwards, and I still remember Marty Feldstein at the Summer Institute waving around a graph saying, look, here's what the aggregate data looked like in 2008. Okay, those rebates were given out, almost half of them were in May, where that vertical red line is. You see those rebates in the aggregate disposable income, big spike which is the green line for disposable income, and then you also had it in June and July, okay? The blue line is consumption, all right? It has a little hump in it. If you look at the saving rate spikes up. So Marty Feldstein and John Taylor, who had also done some simple macro analysis in the AEA papers and proceedings, concluded that the MPC out of the rebate was really low, close to 0. However, just a couple years later, Jonathan Parker and his co-authors came up with some amazing estimates, all right? They estimated MPCs on households in just a great analysis, all right? They thought to add rebate questions to the consumer expenditure survey and then also to the Nielsen study. So they really pivoted it off in existing large surveys. It was a great natural experiment, as I'll talk about. It's randomized who got which rebate when. And then they used what was then state-of-the-art applied micro methods. Okay? When they did that, they estimated very high marginal propensities to consume, depending on the specification, anywhere from 50% to 90%, okay? 0.5 to 0.9, all right? And the majority of spending was on motor vehicles. Okay, so when I saw the first working paper version, I said, wait a minute, didn't Marty Feldstein and John Taylor say the MPC was near 0? Okay, well, other people didn't pay attention to that, and so policymakers, including the ones who spend trillions of dollars, and researchers said, oh, applied micro estimates, those, we know about the credibility revolution, we're going to believe those, and then they completely forgot about the really simple aggregate macro analysis. Okay, so what are the aggregate implications of the Parker et al. Estimate? So I'll talk about some more a little bit later, but let me just motivate here. Here's the graph of expenditure on motor vehicles in 2008. Now, Somm, Shapiro, and Slemrod, they also had used the Michigan survey to estimate MPCs and found ones lower than the Parker et al. And at the back of a very long paper, they did a little comparison and then did a really neat accounting exercise. They said, okay, Jonathan and gang have this MPC of something like 0.37, I forget exactly what it was, for just on motor vehicles alone. What happens if we multiply that by the rebate given out each month and calculate what the induced expenditure that's implied? They had a little table and they said, gosh, that's an awfully big number relative to the total. What this graph does is just take their induced expenditure calculation and subtract it from the actual data to give you a counterfactual. There's no general equilibrium or partial equilibrium here yet because they didn't account for that, and this doesn't do it yet. But if you look at that, it says that if you believe the Parker et al. Estimates, that motor vehicle expenditures would have fallen 87% in the summer of 2008, and then would have recovered when Lehman Brothers was failing. Okay. Now, I've studied the auto industry for years. Nothing like that has ever happened. Nothing like that happened after Lehman Brothers. Didn't even happen during COVID. All right. So, that, inspired by that, is the idea of the counterfactuals. Now, what are the key ingredients you need for a macro counterfactual? So it can't work everywhere, but it can work a lot of places, and it can work at the industry level, by the way. So you need micro or sub-regional estimates of key parameters that are relevant for macro, say MPCs, state, local multipliers, all those sorts of things, okay? You need a policy or event that is big enough to show up in the aggregate data. Okay? And then you need a macro model that can translate those micro estimates to the aggregate. So you need something that's going to take into account general equilibrium, or if you're at the industry level, partial equilibrium. Okay? You also need a narrative analysis. I've done a lot of work on narratives, so this is something I can do. Of the time period surrounding the policy or event to assess whether the macro counterfactual is plausible or not. Okay? So let me give you illustrations. First, I'm going to talk about two examples of micro MPC estimates, two particular events, the 2001, and then I'll revisit the 2008 one. And then if there's time, I'm also going to talk about some of the macro implications of the state level multiplier estimates. All right, so before the 2008 paper, Johnson, Parker, and Soulelis looked at the 2001 rebate, and they had the same idea there. They put these extra questions in the consumer expenditure survey, and then they looked at what was happening at the household level. Also, what I'll call PSJM, or just Parker et al., and then Broda and Parker also had done this for the 2008 rebate. Now, these were just great studies. What's nice is that the US government couldn't give people rebates all in the same month. They had to distribute it over time, and they basically did it randomly because they used the last two digits of the Social Security number, which has no relationship to anything. So it's a random number generator, okay? They then added those extra questions, they used those numbers, and looked at what happened. They used an equation that's been used since at least 1982, when Hall and Michigan actually were the first to use the PSID to test the permanent income hypothesis. The idea there was you look at the change in consumption, you take something that should have been anticipated because both of these rebates were passed before they were distributed, and you, in Parker et al. Case, you put monthly dummy variables in there, you have control variables, and then you have this rebate, which is either the indicator, the amount, they do a variety of specifications. Now, if we were only testing the permanent income hypothesis, it would be perfectly fine to say, okay, we can test whether beta 2 is equal to 0 or not. But they took it a step further. When they found that beta 2 was not equal to 0, they then called that the marginal propensity to consume. Now, Kaplan and Violante questioned that in 2014, and as I'll indicate, what we found is that they were absolutely right to question that interpretation of the beta 2 as an MPC. Okay. So details of the 2001 rebate, President Bush had a tax cut, and it was a 10-year tax cut, and that rebate was basically the down payment on that tax cut. It was $300 to $600 mailed to 92 million households, and the total rebates were about 6% of disposable income, so it shows up in the aggregate data. All right, so you can see it, that shows the rebate, it shows disposable income, there's a big spike. Now, when they construct spending, they construct a non-durable category, which is sort of non-durable the way we say in economic theory, meaning not durable, but it's actually a mix of some non-durables, some services, and actually even some durables, as we found out. And they get an MPC of 0.375, and they actually said there wasn't much spending on motor vehicles. Now, the preliminary analysis they did found a statistically insignificant MPC on total consumption. Turns out that it was less than the MPC on that particular category they used, and they just argued that it was attributable to noise and durables, and so they didn't use total consumption. Oh, thank you. Actually, I have one here, but can you, yeah, thanks. Okay. So what we did, so this is a case where we're saying, okay, well, do these make sense? So this is where we do the counterfactual. So we calculate the induced spending like Sam Shapiro and Slemrod did for this particular case. And we actually try to make it look more plausible by assuming it's averaged over 3 months, even though most of the evidence suggests that 2/3 of the spending occurs in the first month. But so we're letting it smooth out a bit. And then we construct this counterfactual non-durable consumption by taking the aggregate of their categories and subtracting this induced spending. So we're still doing partial equilibrium. So the black line is the actual consumption during 2001, and the purple line is what the counterfactual is implied by this non-GE calculation. All right? Something you'll see in a lot of the counterfactuals I show are going to be these V shapes. All right? It suggests that there would have been a sharp decline and then a recovery. Now, there are no GE effects there. But let me say a couple things. So first of all, plausibility. based on narrative evidence, so this is where you have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out what was going on during these periods, we argue that that counterfactual is implausible. Now, 9/11 did happen, but when we look at things, the overall path, even though we would expect the decline in 2001, it shouldn't be nearly as much, and what happened before and after are still implausible. Okay? The only other 3-month periods with that much decrease in consumption were during COVID and during the 1980 credit crunch and Volcker interest rate increase, where basically consumption just fell off a cliff because of what was going on. But this counterfactual doesn't allow for general equilibrium effects, all right? So how do we do the general equilibrium effects? Well, what we do is take whatever model you want. We take a standard 2-agent new Keynesian model. The reason we use 2-agent is it makes it really easy to calibrate the exact micro stuff so that our model generates data that will give Jonathan Parker his estimates. And then we concentrate on the general equilibrium part. It has sticky wages, sticky prices, variable utilization of capital, a lot of those new Keynesian bells and whistles that get you typically amplification, because usually they want to get more. We calibrate the fraction of hand-to-mouth households to match the MPC. And then we simulate the response of consumption to rebates, okay? We take that deviation from the steady state in our model and subtract it from the actual data, okay? So what do we get? Well, anybody who's worked with the new Keynesian model shouldn't be surprised. Black line is still the actual. Purple line is that calculation I showed you before. Once you add GE in with the new Keynesian bells and whistles, you're going to get amplification. So the plausibility problem becomes worse. Now the red line there, called forecast A, just for historical reasons, is the most pessimistic forecast that we could generate by actually putting in more negative information about the economy than anybody had at the time. And you can see it's just saying there shouldn't have been much of a decline there. So you're not seeing any evidence that would suggest a V shape like you get with these counterfactuals. So a couple comments. We define an idea of a GE MPC to be the general equilibrium response of consumption to the rebate. That is the aggregate change in consumption relative to the rebate. We think of it as the sum of that micro GE and then any kind of amplification effects that you can get from the model. The GE MPC is actually approximately equal to the GDP multiplier in the case of temporary rebates because there's basically no investment response and then we assume a closed economy. Okay, now there's also a nonlinearity in these kinds of models in that if your micro MPC is say 0.38, your GE MPC is just going to be a little bit bigger, 0.5. But if your micro MPC is up to 0.66, which they had in one specification, then your GE MPC goes up to 1.33. So that amplification grows with the micro MPC. So how do you reconcile the micro and macro? In this case, we ended up just having to look at the micro estimates. But let me just say, it's going to be either, we know the GE MPC, all right, if you believe our plausibility and narrative. So either you've got to have smaller micro MPCs, or you've got to have more dampening in your general equilibrium model. So we re-examine the micro MPCs and the CEX data, and then we also consider possible modifications to the tank model. All right, so this is the typical one good tank model. We could do things like have monetary policy be less accommodative, or we could make supply less elastic by, say, having more cost to variable utilization of capital. You know, anybody who's worked with these models, it's very easy to, if you're not trying to calibrate carefully to some other good estimate, you can just, make the amplification less. But we never got to that point because we first did the micro estimates, okay? So we looked at their categories and then compared them to the Bureau of Economic Analysis categories of non-durables and services. And when we did that, we actually found something surprising, because when we started looking at the subcategories, some of them had negative MPCs, some of those were significant, and there are a lot of categories. So, you know, if you have 100 of these, just by randomness, you could have negative MPCs, but we saw a few more. And the Johnson-Parker-Soulelis definitions, the strict non-durables had a pretty low MPC, but it was the broader category they called non-durables, which I said was also services. That's where they got their 0.32, and this is our replication of it. But if you go to the CEX and you use the Bureau of Economic Analysis definitions of those categories, you get estimates that are very close to zero on the MPCs. You know, who would have guessed? So the BEA category suggests MPCs near zero, and so we didn't need to have dampening in the general equilibrium just for the sake of argument, because we're not sure that the 2001 data give us enough precision to say anything about MPCs, okay? So their estimates are not robust to different categorizations. So, you know, some of these other categories had negative values. And then the other thing about the 2001, and again, this is where more scrutiny is useful, that wasn't a temporary tax rebate. That was a down payment on a 10-year tax rebate, all right? Now, if you have permanent income hypothesis, but who happen not to be Ricardian, right? You could still be an individual optimizer, but believe somebody who tells you that if G is greater than R, you don't have to ever raise taxes to finance your budget deficits, then, you know, you might still have a higher MPC, something like 0.33. Now, with Ricardian equivalence, it should be around zero. So our conclusion about the 2001 tax rebate is that the experiment just is not precise enough to take any of those estimates and be serious in our macro models, okay? And it was just useful. And to be clear, what Parker and his co-authors did was state-of-the-art, very, very nice work. But our knowledge has moved on. You know, we just looking at this some more in retrospect, with the help of these implausible counterfactuals, we can go back and look at this data. So let's see, I think, yeah, and then factoring in GE amplifies the problem. So I said that. So let me go back to the 2008 rebates. That's where we spent the most amount of time. These were much bigger, $100 billion, 11% of disposable income. The average amount received by a recipient was close to $1,000. And they were passed in February 2008, and distributed basically April through, or May through August, okay? The rebates were temporary, so it's a much cleaner experiment. And the following is based on my joint work with Johannes Wieland and Jake Orchard. And it's the micro MPCs and macro counterfactuals, the case of the 2008 rebates, because I watch a lot of murder mysteries, and so, you know, I like the case of the thing. A lot of detective work, really, that's done here. All right, so I already showed you the counterfactual implied by motor vehicles, but that didn't have any general equilibrium effects, and it didn't talk about total consumption, and we just saw how different categories made a difference in 2001. So let's go back and look at these. All right, now, to do a GE counterfactual here, it's different, because remember the original estimate said a big part of the spending was actually on motor vehicles, all right? So we come up with what we call a TG tank model, which is a two-agent New Keynesian model that has both durables and non-durables, and we interpret the durables as motor vehicles, okay? So then we argue that the high micro MPCs imply implausible macro counterfactuals, and we do a lot of narrative analysis of the events of summer 2008. We look at the effect of oil prices, because they did go up and then down after Lehman Brothers. And we look at what the professional forecasters were saying. We look at the most pessimistic forecast of that time, which was the Goldman Sachs forecast. And then we also looked at the most pessimistic person in the survey of professional forecasters. We also come up with our own forecasting model, where we are even more pessimistic, because we use in that model, we assume that you know for certain you're in a recession, oil prices are increasing exogenously, and that Lehman Brothers fails. Okay, So I'll show you those estimates in a bit. So a little bit about the details of the too good, too agent model. And this, we really learned a lot from having to do this counterfactual, because it became clear, Johannes kind of already knew this because of his work with Alistair Mackay in Econometrica and AR Insights, but durables are really different, all right? Because there is a really high intertemporal elasticity of substitution in durables, much more so than non-durables. So what we do is, again, with our two-agent model, we calibrate things so that we can generate data on households so that the Parker et al. Group can estimate the same kinds of micro MPCs that we have. In our baseline model, even though we have durables being different in utility, in the baseline model, we just assume that there's perfect substitutability in production of durables and non-durables. But you'll see that that's an important assumption that we figured out we have to weaken. And then we match the timing of the rebate. So this is the general equilibrium for total consumption with these micro MPCs on total consumption, but where a lot of it is due to the motor vehicles, because that's a big part of it, calibrated to that. So the black line is consumption in 2008, the actual consumption, total. The purple line is the lower bound of the Parker et al. Estimates for the 2008 rebate. The green line is the upper bound of their estimates, close to 0.9. You can see dramatic V shapes. Now, I'm also showing there the blue line, which is an MPC of 0.3, and when we go back to the micro data, this is going to be one of our favorite MPCs. Okay? All of them show basically a collapse in summer 2008, and then a recovery when Lehman Brothers is failing, and then a gentle downward slope. Okay? And there was just nothing else in that summer that was even anywhere near the order of Lehman Brothers. So that's why we argue that it's implausible. The red line is the most pessimistic forecast we can come up with using a time series model, putting in all this extra information. And so you could say the MPC, according to the aggregate data, and if you believe our narrative, that it's basically the integral between the black line and the red line. That's the maximum GE MPC that you should be able to get out of that, and it's below 0.2. But if we say, okay, according to the plausibility exercise, that GE MPC cannot be above 0.2 and is probably even below 0.1, so then what we have to do is figure out, is there something wrong with the micro MPC estimates, or is there something wrong with the model? We actually figured out that it was both, okay? So, what we do is, when we look at the micro MPC estimates, let me go back one, we go back, and we'd been working on this paper for a long time, but couldn't figure out how to reconcile things. And then there's this wonderful burst of econometrics research, where they figured out that what had been state of the art when Parker et al. Were doing their analysis with diff and diff estimates had all these problems, that you had, suddenly it's escaped, forbidden comparisons that you're actually doing, and all of these other sorts of things. We actually found even more biases. We found 3 biases, and when we corrected those, the micro MPC fell to 0.3. Okay, so we figured out, and then when we also used some of the leading other methods like Borusiuk, Harvel, and Spies, we also get that kind of decline in the MPC, and they came up with these new econometric methods, and it makes a difference. Okay. Now, when we have that, we still get that V shape. That was that blue line. There was still a bit of a V shape. So then what we do is we go back to that macro model, the too good, too agent model, and we say, geez, when we looked at the data, when those rebates came out, the relative price of motor vehicles increased a little over 1% right when those rebates came out. So we said, the short-run supply curve of motor vehicles in terms of non-durables is upward sloping. All right. So we calibrate our model so that we get, to basically the really good micro estimates, or at least we haven't scrutinized those as much as we have these others, but we calibrate to those micro estimates, the elasticity, so that we can match those. And what we find is that small 1% increase in the price of motor vehicles leads the optimizing households who don't get rebates to hold off on buying their cars. Because they have that high intertemporal elasticity of substitution, they're willing to do that. And if you look at the narrative during that summer, a lot of the dealers were running out of inventory at the time that the motor vehicle inventory, at the time that those rebates were being given out. So when we do that, we take our new estimate of a micro MPC for total consumption of 0.3, and then virtually all of it we find is on motor vehicles. So just think of it as they took their checks, put on a down payment on a car, and bought a car. When we use that, and then when we put in this upward sloping supply curve for motor vehicles, we get dampening so that we actually get a GE MPC of less than 0.1. So we have both dampening and lower micro estimates. So the lessons from this, so each time we do one of these, we learn new lessons, so it's kind of useful. The addition of durable goods is crucial for our dampening result because durables have more elastic demand than non-durables. The overall MPC and the distribution of spending across durables and non-durables really matters for the general equilibrium outcome. If we calibrate the MPC to 0.3 in a one-good model, we still get implausible V-shapes on those. So one of the things we're kind of a big message from this is that the heterogeneity of goods, particularly when you're talking about durables, is as important as the heterogeneity of agents. And the reconciliation implies that the multiplier is pretty darn low. Let me just talk briefly about a final example, which is state-level multiplier estimates. So to be clear, this method can be used on all kinds of things. It's just, I've gone through replication files on all of the multiplier ones, and so that's why I talk about that. So this is based on the really nice paper by Gabe Chaudhary-Reich and the AJ Economic Policy about the Obama stimulus spending. So there were a bunch of estimates where people had used different instruments and were getting wildly different estimates of how many jobs were created per dollar or per $100,000. What he figured out was the way people were implementing this, there were all these differences in the details, and once he used what I think is the best practice methods, didn't matter which of those instruments you used, you actually got very similar numbers. And his headline number was 2 jobs created for every $100,000, and that's actually roughly equal to the kind of GDP multiplier of 2. All right. Now, using theoretical insights from Farhi and Warning, he argues that because the US economy was at the zero lower bound then, the aggregate multiplier was also around 2. That was a lower bound on the aggregate multiplier, so at least 2. So, creating the macro counterfactual. So I actually did this in a discussion at the Peterson Institute, and it was published in, was it Reconsidering Macro or something there, because I was really inspired by Sam Shapiro and Slemrod's counterfactual thing. So I did it for Gabe's. So he shows in his online appendix the impulse response function of how many jobs per month after the rebate, and he's using cross-sectional variation, so basically 50 states, okay? I then took that and made some assumptions on labor force participation not being very cyclical, which is reasonable, and said, okay, if we believe those jobs created, what I'm going to do is that same kind of calculation where I take his impulse response each month and see what happens in terms of how much extra unemployment you would have gotten. So there is the graph. The green line is the actual unemployment rate. So the actual unemployment went up and hit close to 10% and then stayed high for quite a while. So remember that lasting slump. If you believe his numbers, then that suggests a counterfactual. This doesn't have general equilibrium in it, of the red line, which is that the unemployment rate would have gone up to 15.5%, okay? Just counting from when Lehman failed in September 2008 to when it first hit that peak in January 2010, actual unemployment rate went up 3.7%. The counterfactual said, had there been no Obama stimulus, it would have gone up by 9.3 percentage points from Lehman to that point. Now let's do a comparison. Going back to the Great Depression, the unemployment rate, if we say count from the stock market crash, which is kind of like the Lehman Brothers idea, but rather than just the start of the recession, I can tell you later why I did it that way. Then in the 16 months, so the same number of months after the stock market crash, the unemployment rate went up 9.8%, okay? Now you say, all right, they're similar. Well, then that says, if you say, okay, they should be similar, well, the Federal Reserve in 1929, 1930 was letting the money supply collapse, the monetary base and all of that. Meanwhile, the one in the 2008, and 2009, and 2010 were doing whatever it takes, Ben Bernanke and the gang, TARP, and all those sorts of things. If you believe these numbers, it means, maybe what they did didn't matter. The unemployment, it was that Obama stimulus that kept us out of the Great Depression. So I think that's probably less plausible. So because I had noticed this when I wrote my Journal of Economic Perspectives piece, I said, well, let me look at the estimates. So his estimates are really good, but something I noticed is that almost everybody who had worked in that literature in the cross-state part had not made the estimates nationally representative because they use per capita. And so North Dakota, which has 700,000 people, was counted the same as California, which has 40 million people, okay? Now, this could be a problem if there are heterogeneous treatment effects. So I just did some simple things in the JEP piece where also I noticed that they didn't include induced state spending because there was some induced state spending. So when I basically weighted by population and included state government spending in the denominator, I got an estimate of 0.9 jobs rather than 2 created per 100,000. Now, that still suggests that the Obama stimulus made a difference because when I do that same calculation there, I get that the unemployment rate would have risen to 12.4% rather than, what was it, 9.8%. So it says it did matter, okay, if you believe these numbers, but just maybe not as much as you might see with the 2. Okay. So, summary and conclusions. So I've argued that we can really exploit this confluence of bringing applied micro kind of techniques and estimates into macro to use those to then check things to see whether some experiment that has aggregate effects gives you a plausible or not so plausible counterfactual when you look at what's going on in the aggregate. I illustrated with 3 examples from my work. And what was really rewarding about these things is I think that the search for reconciliation just led to all kinds of insights and serendipity that you might not have expected to find. So if you're only looking at microestimates, then you might not realize this important point about the heterogeneity of goods and macro models. And also, this can be used for natural experiments in other countries. You can think about it if somebody has an estimate in industrial organization for industry X, you can see if that particular estimate of the elasticity leads to funny industry counterfactuals if you're plugged through an experiment during an episode. And industrial organization economists are really good at narratives about industry there. So, thank you.
Is Johnson, Parker, or Soleles here? I'm joking, I'm joking. I would have loved you to give this at Stanford when we were students. We have time for some questions, unless your name is Johnson, Parker, and Susulilis. I know you're all shy. She's scary. Anyone? I know, right? She's really good. Actually, you should send her your stuff before you publish it, because she could be up here talking about you. Okay, I know you're all shy, but Valerie's here for all 3 days. And so for those of you who want to chat with her, she's really, really knowledgeable about these things. So anybody? See, Chari's not here. He would have thrown his hand up. Okay, here we go. Somebody brave.
In that case, was 2008 was the tax rebate, but without tax rebate, we could have had something else, like another type of fiscal policy. So when you ask worst case scenarios in terms of forecast, maybe they include this sort of fiscal stabilizers. And I don't know whether that's the right counterpart.
No, so that's a very good point. The idea is, what were the forecasts at the time predicting? And we actually talk about that in detail in our 2008 one. So Goldman Sachs, when we described the Goldman Sachs forecast, which was one of the most pessimistic, they had particular assumptions about what was going to happen to the federal funds rate, that it was going to be decreased. And in fact, it was decreased even faster than they forecasted. They also assumed that a tax rebate would be passed, but not till the second half of the year. And so we discussed that. So that's a very good point, that we have to be careful when we look at the forecast in terms of what they're assuming in the forecast. So it just shows you, I glossed over it. Doing the narrative and the plausibility is very challenging. And basically, I have to make the case to you that something is implausible or less plausible. So one of the things you could do is, you could think of it as what, based on the evidence, you could almost give a plausibility parameter to something. And then I've always thought that, maybe we could use that as a prior when we're doing the estimates for the micro estimates. But yeah, that's one of the important pillars of this method, is you can't skip the narrative step, because then people will ask exactly this.
Thank you.
Okay, so I don't know if this is a fair representation of what you said, but my feeling is that in one case, basically the RDD wasn't done properly according to current standard. So the micro estimate has to be revisited. In the second case, it was weighting states differently instead of equally.
Right.
So in this conflict between the micro estimates and the macro models, it seems that the first thing to look at is how you do the estimates. And then, because maybe aggregate data looks different, or because the narrative approach tells us the counterfactual is implausible, then the micro estimates has to be wrong. But in what you said, I don't see much of a message for how to change our model, as much as to the micro people, how to do their measurement. Is it a fair representation of what you said, or am I simplifying too much?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's how it turned out in these three cases. But the first version of our 2008 paper, we were trying to do something simple. We had the one good model, and we said, okay, we can do dampening, and then we just started doing the standard, make monetary policy less accommodative, da-da-da-da-da. So had we not realized that this special thing about durables, we might have had to do that, but then that calls into question all of the other applications of the new Keynesian model that use those same parameters that we were suddenly dampening down. So I think it really matters on a case-by-case basis. I mean, this is more, artisan work. This is not mass production work that you have to do.
Amazing talk, thank you. So you said that in Parker and Company's estimates, it's important which categories are included under the durables. Can you give a few examples which categories are key? And also, are there other details that we should pay attention to when understanding these microestimates?
Yes, and actually this is where Johannes was in the weeds, and I haven't looked at it. Yes. Do you remember which categories had the jewelry, which is a durable, bling, the bling MPC. Yeah, I mean, see, what we see with a lot of these is the expenditures are going up, but they're going up on things that are assets, right? You can count cars, jewelry, and to the extent that if there's a short-run increasing supply curve on whatever thing that's counted as consumption in the aggregate data, but they're spending on, that micro estimate may not reflect the aggregate because you're having all that crowding out. So, yeah.
Someone's got to defend the micro people, I guess. Not sure if it's me. So these numbers have standard errors, and the micro estimates also, and you pointed out these are very nonlinear effects. So I can imagine you can get a lot of action just by bringing standard errors in macro at some point.
Absolutely.
Why, which you did, but not today. So the question is that difficult? Is there a natural way of doing it? You just take the extreme parameters, or it's something more subtle about it?
No, I think that, and Jonathan was always upfront about this, their standard errors are not small. You can do the statistical test against 0, but there's a pretty wide confidence span. The problem is when policymakers call and say, what's the estimate? They don't, even if you say the standard errors, they're not paying attention to that. As I said, another kind of thing, if one comes up with sort of these plausibility weights, you could try to use that as a prior to improve the standard errors. Just bringing in more information, more information, more data, it's better.
All right, let's give Valerie another round of applause. And have a great rest of the day.